When Maria Jackson boarded her own airline as an undercover flight attendant, she never expected to become a victim of discrimination. Flight manager Richard Whitmore didn't recognize the CEO behind the uniform, only seeing an older black woman who didn't fit his idea of first-class service. But Maria's humiliation quickly turned to determination. As she uncovered a systematic pattern of age and racial discrimination across the company, a battle for justice began. Witness the shocking confrontation when Richard and his boss faced the music in front of the entire board. See how one woman's courage transforms not just her airline, but an entire industry. Will Maria's bold decision to expose discrimination help or hurt Atlantic Airlines? Comment below with whether you think companies should prioritize justice over profits, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of powerful comebacks against discrimination. Maria Jackson adjusted her navy blue uniform collar as she boarded Flight AL 247, a daily nonstop from Atlanta to San Francisco. At 58, she felt a familiar comfort in the crisp lines of the attire she hadn't worn in nearly 15 years. Her natural gray streaks contrasted elegantly against her dark hair, pulled back in a neat bun according to company regulations she herself had helped write. Just like riding a bike, she whispered to herself, smoothing the Atlantic Airlines pin above her heart, the same pin she'd worn as a flight attendant for 20 years before climbing the corporate ladder. This undercover mission wasn't a publicity stunt or executive whim. Atlantic Airlines had received a disturbing uptick in customer complaints about discriminatory treatment, particularly on premium routes. The board suggested sending in mystery shoppers, but Maria had a better idea. She would evaluate the service herself from the inside. "Credentials look in order, Ms. Jackson," said Amelia, the check-in supervisor who wasn't part of the small circle aware of Maria's true identity as Atlantic's CEO and majority shareholder. "You'll be assisting in first class today. Richard Whitmore is your flight manager." Maria nodded, recalling Richard's impressive resume. Poached from a competitor 6 months ago, his flights consistently received high marks for efficiency. She was eager to see his management style firsthand. The pre-flight briefing was brisk and professional. Richard, a tall man in his early 40s with immaculately styled blonde hair, ran through the passenger manifest with military precision. "We have 3 VIPs in first class today," Richard announced, showing photos on his tablet. "A tech CEO, a state senator, and a professional athlete. These passengers deserve our absolute best." He turned to Maria. "Jackson, you're new to this route. Stay in the background until you learn our standards." The slight dismissiveness in his tone caught Maria's attention, but she maintained her role. "Yes, sir. I have experience in first class from my previous airlines have different standards," Richard interrupted. "Just follow Lisa's lead today." During boarding, Maria assisted economy passengers efficiently, drawing on skills that had become second nature decades ago. After takeoff, she prepared to rotate into first class as planned in the briefing. She approached the galley, dividing the cabins when Richard intercepted her. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was quiet but sharp. "Rotating to first class for beverage service as discussed in the briefing," Maria replied calmly. Richard looked her up and down, his expression hardening. "There's been a change of plan. Lisa can handle it alone." "Is there a problem?" Maria asked, his eyes narrowed. "Look, Atlantic Airlines has an image to maintain in first class. No offense, but you don't." He gestured vaguely at her. "Fit that image." Maria felt her chest tighten but kept her expression neutral. "I don't understand." "My uniform is regulation and I'm fully qualified." "It's not about qualifications," Richard said with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Our premium passengers have certain expectations about who serves them. We need youthful energy up front." A first-class passenger, a middle-aged white man in a tailored suit, approached the galley. "Excuse me, could I get some water?" Richard's demeanor transformed instantly. "Of course, sir. Lisa will assist you right away." He turned to Maria and whispered, "Stay in economy where you belong. That's an order." The passenger glanced between them, noticing the tension. "Is everything all right?" "Just fine, sir," Richard assured him. "A minor scheduling confusion." Maria recognized the passenger, Jake Turner, aviation journalist for Global Travel Monthly. His eyes lingered on her name tag briefly before he nodded and returned to his seat. "This isn't right," Maria said quietly once the passenger was out of earshot. "What isn't right is questioning my authority," Richard snapped. "One more word and I'll report insubordination. Now get back to economy." Maria considered revealing her identity then and there, but her instincts told her to see this through. The discrimination complaints suddenly made perfect sense. She needed to document this behavior properly. She turned without another word and walked back to economy, feeling Richard's gaze burning into her back. As she assisted an elderly passenger with her beverage, Maria noticed Jake Turner watching thoughtfully from first class, his journalist's eyes missing nothing. Just following orders, she thought grimly, already planning her next move. This wasn't just about one flight or one manager anymore. The problem clearly ran deeper than she had imagined. Maria maintained her professional composure in economy class, efficiently serving passengers while processing Richard's discriminatory behavior. After completing the first service round, she made a strategic decision to document the incident properly rather than letting it slide. During a brief lull in service, Maria approached the rear galley where another flight attendant, Tamika, was preparing coffee. "Everything okay?" Tamika asked, noticing Maria's controlled but tense expression. "I need to file an incident report," Maria replied quietly. "Richard prevented me from serving in first class with some concerning comments about my appearance and age." Tamika's eyes widened slightly. "You're not the first. He's been doing this rotation for 3 months and it's always the same pattern. Older crew and people of color get pushed to economy regardless of seniority. Has anyone reported it?" Two flight attendants did. Nothing happened except their schedules suddenly became less desirable. Tamika glanced around nervously. "Look, I can't afford to lose my preferred routes. I have kids in college." Maria nodded, understanding. "I appreciate the information." When mid-flight service preparations began, Maria decided to address the situation directly through proper channels. She approached Richard in the forward galley with her company tablet displaying the Atlantic Airlines operational manual. "Mr. Whitmore, according to Section 5.3 of our procedures, cabin crew rotations are mandatory for flights exceeding 4 hours. I'm scheduled to rotate to first class for the second service." Her tone was polite but firm, presenting facts rather than emotions. Richard's face hardened. "I make the operational decisions on this aircraft, not some outdated manual." He lowered his voice. "Let me be blunt, first-class passengers pay a premium for a certain experience. You don't fit that image." "And what image is that exactly?" Maria asked, maintaining steady eye contact. "Younger, more vibrant staff who reflect our brand." He gestured dismissively at her hair. "The gray doesn't project the right energy." A nearby passenger looked up from his laptop, clearly overhearing. It was Jake Turner again, the aviation journalist, who quickly returned his attention to his screen but appeared to be listening intently. "My appearance meets every regulation in our employee handbook," Maria countered. "I'd like to understand the specific policy you're applying." Richard's expression darkened. "You're being insubordinate. This conversation is over." As Maria turned to leave, Richard grabbed her arm. "One more thing, your attitude will be noted in your performance review." Maria looked pointedly at his hand until he released her. "Please don't touch me again without consent. That's a clear violation of company policy." The confrontation caught the attention of several first-class passengers who watched with undisguised interest. One passenger had their phone angled in a way that suggested they might be recording. "Return to your assigned section immediately," Richard ordered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "and consider yourself written up for insubordination." As Maria walked away, she heard Richard addressing the first-class cabin. "I apologize for the disruption, ladies and gentlemen. We strive to maintain certain standards in first class. Please let me know if you need anything at all." Back in economy, Maria documented everything in precise detail on her personal phone, including timestamps and exact quotes. She knew that memory could fade and details would matter. As she worked, she noticed Jake Turner making his way to the economy restroom, passing by her service station. "Quite a situation up there," he remarked casually as he returned to first class. "Shame how some managers create hostile environments. I've seen it too often in my industry reporting." He slipped her a business card discreetly. "If you ever want to discuss workplace culture at Atlantic, I'd be interested in hearing more." Maria pocketed the card without comment, maintaining her cover. Near the end of the flight, as passengers prepared for landing, Richard approached Maria at her jump seat. "I've filed a formal complaint about your behavior," he informed her with cold satisfaction. "I've recommended administrative leave pending review. We can't have staff who don't understand their place." "My place," Maria repeated, "in this company, in this industry." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some people just don't belong in premium service. Nothing personal, just business." As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Maria felt a calm determination replacing her initial shock. The systematic discrimination was worse than any complaint had suggested. This wasn't just about one uncomfortable interaction, it was about a culture that needed to change. And she was in a unique position to change it. Jake Turner sat in first class, methodically typing notes on his laptop while occasionally glancing toward the economy cabin. With 25 years of aviation journalism experience, he had developed an instinct for recognizing significant industry moments. This was undoubtedly one of them. He recognized Maria Jackson immediately. Anyone who had covered the aviation industry knew her remarkable story. From flight attendant to operations director, then COO, and finally CEO and controlling shareholder of Atlantic Airlines. Under her leadership, the airline had transformed from a struggling regional carrier to a respected national competitor with industry-leading employee satisfaction ratings. which made Richard Whitmore's behavior all the more shocking. Jake had been documenting the industry's diversity problems for years, but rarely had he witnessed such blatant discrimination firsthand, especially toward someone of Maria's stature, though Richard clearly had no idea who she really was. As the plane began its final approach to San Francisco, Jake closed his laptop and formulated a plan. This story had profound implications for Atlantic Airlines and the industry at large, but journalistic ethics demanded thorough verification before publication. After landing, Jake deliberately took his time gathering his belongings, allowing most passengers to deplane ahead of him. He watched as Richard stood at the exit, offering practiced smiles and thanking first-class passengers while completely ignoring Maria's presence in economy. When nearly everyone had deplaned, Jake approached Maria, who was assisting an elderly passenger with her overhead bag. "Thank you for your assistance," he said, making sure Richard was out of earshot. "I couldn't help noticing the situation earlier. Mind if we talk once you're off duty?" Maria studied him carefully. "I remember you from your byline photo in Global Travel Monthly. You're Jake Turner, guilty as charged," he smiled. "I've followed your career for years, Ms. Jackson." The Atlantic Airlines turnaround story is legendary in the industry. "You recognized me," she stated rather than asked. "I did, but your flight manager evidently didn't." Jake lowered his voice. "What I witnessed today was troubling on multiple levels. I've heard rumors about discriminatory practices affecting crew assignments across several airlines, but seeing it directed at you confirms a systemic issue." Maria glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "This isn't about me personally, Mr. Turner. It's about a pattern that affects many employees without my position or power." "Precisely why it matters," Jake replied. "If this happens to the CEO, imagine what happens to regular crew members with no recourse." Maria considered this. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Information exchange," Jake said. "I've been investigating diversity issues in airline cabin crews for a feature article. I can share my research findings with you, and perhaps you can provide context for what I observed today, all off the record until you decide otherwise." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Meet me at the Skyview Lounge in Terminal 2 in 1 hour." Jake watched her walk away, noting how she maintained perfect professionalism despite the situation. He then proceeded to the terminal, where he immediately began making calls to his contacts within Atlantic Airlines. In the crew lounge, Maria changed out of her flight attendant uniform and into the business attire she had packed. She heard a knock on the locker room door. "Maria, it's Tamika, can we talk?" Maria opened the door. "Of course." Tamika stepped inside, visibly nervous. "I didn't know who you were at first, but another crew member recognized you after landing." She hesitated. "What Richard did, it's not isolated. Several of us have documented similar incidents, but previous complaints disappeared into HR." "Do you have names, dates, documentation?" Maria asked. "We all do." "We formed an informal support group of about 12 crew members, mostly older women and people of color who have been systematically pushed out of premium cabins despite seniority." Maria's expression remained calm, but her resolve strengthened. "Would you be willing to share these accounts officially? If we knew we'd be protected, yes, but Richard has connections in management." "You have my word that there will be no retaliation," Maria assured her. "Can you gather as many detailed accounts as possible by tomorrow morning?" "We've been gathering them for months," Tamika admitted, pulling out her phone, "just waiting for someone who would actually listen." At the Skyview Lounge, Jake was already waiting when Maria arrived. He had compiled a preliminary dossier containing interviews with former Atlantic employees describing experiences similar to what Maria had encountered. "His pattern is consistent across multiple reports," Jake explained, showing her his research. "And it's not just Atlantic, 3 other major carriers have similar issues with first-class cabin segregation based on age and race." Maria reviewed the documentation carefully. "This goes deeper than one flight manager." "Exactly. It's a cultural problem disguised as brand standards and passenger expectations," Jake replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Maria looked up from the documents. "Something comprehensive, and I may need your help to do it right." Maria arrived at Atlantic Airlines headquarters at 6 a.m. the following morning, a full 2 hours before her executive team's regular schedule. She accessed the executive suite using her security credentials and went straight to work, methodically establishing a secure digital environment for the investigation. She created a confidential folder structure on the company's secure server with restricted access permissions, then connected with Diane Phillips via encrypted message, requesting an urgent meeting at 7 a.m. Diane, Atlantic's head of HR and a 20-year veteran of the company, arrived promptly. Her eyes widened when she saw Maria in the conference room surrounded by tablets displaying flight schedules, personnel files, and complaint records. "I didn't expect to find you setting up a war room at this hour." Diane remarked, closing the door behind her. What I'm about to share requires complete discretion, Maria began, her tone measured and precise. Yesterday, I conducted an undercover assessment as a flight attendant on Flight AL 247. Maria methodically detailed her experience with Richard Whitmore, presenting both her personal documentation and the evidence Tamika had provided, which included 12 similar incidents documented by different employees over the past 6 months. This is deeply concerning, Diane said, reviewing the materials. But I'm troubled by something else. None of these complaints reached executive level. They should have triggered our anti-discrimination protocols automatically. That's precisely why we're meeting privately, Maria replied. I need to understand where the system broke down before we proceed with formal action. They began a systematic audit of HR records, cross-referencing employee complaints against official documentation. Within an hour, they identified a disturbing pattern. Discrimination complaints against certain managers, including Richard, had been consistently downgraded in severity classification or marked as resolved without proper investigation. These complaint categorizations were manually overridden, Diane observed, pointing to the digital trail, by someone with administrative access. Can you identify who? Diane navigated through several security layers. The credentials belong to Robert Keller, the VP of In-Flight Services, Maria noted, Richard's direct supervisor and the person who advocated most strongly for his hiring. Maria instructed Diane to expand the investigation scope, examining complaint patterns across all flight routes and comparing them against crew assignment changes over the past year. We need complete data segregation by age, race, gender, and seniority level, Maria specified, and correlate that with premium cabin assignment changes. By 9 a.m., the pattern was undeniable. Data visualization showed a systematic reduction in premium cabin assignments for flight attendants over 50 and people of color, despite their seniority. The trend had accelerated significantly after Richard's hiring and several other managers who shared similar management philosophies. Cross-reference these assignment changes with passenger satisfaction scores, Maria requested. Diane compiled the data, which revealed no correlation between the demographic shifts and passenger ratings. In fact, experienced flight attendants consistently received higher satisfaction scores regardless of age or race. The passenger expectations justification is completely fabricated, Diane concluded. Maria's phone chimed with a message from Jake Turner, additional sources confirming similar incidents. Robert Keller mentioned specifically by 3 former employees, available to meet when you're ready. Maria turned to Diane. We need to establish a secure channel with legal and prepare for potential board involvement. But first, I want complete personnel files for both Richard and Robert, including all communications regarding crew assignments and complaint handling. That would require special authorization, Diane noted. Accessing executive communications without notice is. I'm authorizing it now, Maria interrupted firmly. Document everything with timestamp verification. We need to establish whether this represents individual bias or systemic discrimination with executive knowledge. By 11 a.m., they had assembled compelling evidence. Email exchanges between Richard and Robert discussing refreshing the premium cabin image and alignment with the aspirational brand profile, alongside numerous crew reassignments targeting older employees and people of color. In one particularly damning email, Robert had written to Richard, "Your approach to first-class staffing aligns with my vision. The old guard might complain, but they don't understand modern premium service demographics. Keep making the necessary adjustments. I'll handle any noise from HR." This goes beyond individual discrimination, Maria concluded, her expression somber but resolved. This is a coordinated effort to systematically push certain employees out of visible positions regardless of their qualifications or performance. Maria scheduled a confidential meeting with the company's general counsel for 1 p.m., then contacted Jake Turner to arrange a discreet meeting. I need to know if this extends beyond Atlantic, she explained when they connected. Is this an industry practice we've inadvertently adopted or something cultivated internally? Jake arrived at her office at noon with additional documentation. Based on my sources, this appears to be a growing trend across several carriers, but Atlantic's implementation is particularly aggressive and systematic. The difference is that other airlines maintain plausible deniability, while your executives left a clear paper trail. Maria reviewed his research carefully. Thank you for bringing this to light. I'll need to address it comprehensively, not just for Atlantic but potentially for the industry. As Maria prepared for her legal consultation, she received a text from Tamika, more crew members coming forward with documentation. Currently at 24 and counting, we're ready to support whatever action you take. Maria gazed out her office window at an Atlantic Airlines jet taking off in the distance. The company she had built from near bankruptcy to industry recognition had developed a cancer in its culture, when she was now determined to remove completely. Maria scheduled an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. the following day, carefully structuring the agenda to address operational standards review without revealing the full scope of her findings. She instructed her executive assistant to include Richard Whitmore and Robert Keller as presenters for the In-Flight Service Standards segment. At 8:45 a.m., board members began arriving at Atlantic Airlines' executive conference room. The company's 11 directors, a mix of industry veterans, financial experts, and corporate governance specialists, exchanged pleasantries while reviewing the meeting materials Maria had distributed that morning. "Quite the urgent meeting, Maria," remarked Josephine Reeves, the lead independent director. "The agenda mentions service standards, but your pre-meeting brief suggests something more serious." "I believe in transparency with this board," Maria replied quietly. "What we'll discuss today impacts the core values of this airline. I've structured the meeting to allow the facts to speak for themselves." At precisely 9 a.m., Maria called the meeting to order, beginning with standard performance updates. At 9:30, she introduced the next agenda item. "We'll now review our premium cabin service standards and implementation," Maria announced. "I've asked our VP of In-Flight Services, Robert Keller, and one of our flight managers, Richard Whitmore, to present their current approach." Robert appeared surprised at Richard's inclusion but maintained his composure. "Thank you, Maria. I wasn't aware Richard would be joining us, but he's certainly an exemplary manager implementing our service vision." For the next 20 minutes, Robert outlined Atlantic's premium service differentiation strategy, emphasizing the importance of alignment between passenger expectations and crew presentation. His slides featured images of predominantly young, white flight attendants in first-class cabins. "Our premium service philosophy focuses on providing an aspirational experience," Robert explained. "Richard has been particularly effective at implementing these standards on our transcontinental routes." Maria then invited Richard to elaborate on his implementation methods. Clearly flattered by the executive attention, Richard confidently expanded on his approach. "I select crew members who embody Atlantic's premium image," he explained. "First-class passengers expect service providers who reflect success and vitality. My cabin assignment decisions are always based on maintaining that aspirational standard." "Could you elaborate on your selection criteria?" Maria asked neutrally. "Certainly, premium cabin crew should project energy, sophistication, and polished appearance. Some crew members, despite technical qualifications, simply don't match the premium brand aesthetic." "And how do you determine who meets this aesthetic?" Maria pressed. "It's a holistic assessment," Richard replied, growing slightly defensive. "Experience shows that younger crew members generally connect better with our premium passengers." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you both for your candor. Before we continue, I'd like to introduce a relevant perspective. Diane Phillips from HR will present some data on passenger satisfaction correlations." Diane displayed a comprehensive analysis showing that passenger satisfaction scores had no correlation with flight attendant age or race. In fact, more experienced crew members consistently received higher ratings across all metrics. "This contradicts the premise of your selection approach," Maria observed. "If passenger satisfaction doesn't support these aesthetic criteria, what actually drives these staffing decisions?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Data doesn't capture the intangible elements of premium service perception." "Perhaps a specific example would be illuminating," Maria suggested. She signaled her assistant, who distributed sealed folders to each board member. "Yesterday, I conducted an undercover assessment as a flight attendant on Flight AL 247. Richard's face drained of color as Maria methodically recounted her experience, supported by documentation, witness statements, and Tamika's collected evidence from other affected employees. "This isn't an isolated incident," Maria continued, directing the board to review the contents of their folders. "We've identified a systematic pattern of discrimination against older employees and people of color in premium cabin assignments, documented across multiple flights and supported by internal communications." Board members examined the evidence in stunned silence. The folders contained email exchanges, statistical analyses, and testimonials from affected employees. "Richard," Maria addressed him directly, "did you recognize me as your CEO yesterday?" "Of course not," Richard stammered. "I would never have." "Treated the CEO that way?" Maria finished. "That's precisely the problem. No employee should experience such treatment regardless of their position." She turned to Robert. "And you've been protecting these practices, intercepting complaints, and ensuring they never reached appropriate channels for investigation." Robert's face hardened. We're simply maintaining standards that passengers expect, even if they won't explicitly state those expectations in surveys. You believe our passengers expect discriminatory service standards? Maria asked pointedly. It's not discrimination, it's brand alignment, Robert insisted, growing visibly frustrated. Every premium airline makes these decisions, we're just more efficient about it. To be clear, Maria stated for the record, you're acknowledging that you deliberately implemented a system to remove older workers and people of color from premium cabins despite their qualifications and performance ratings. Twisting my words, Robert objected. These are legitimate business decisions to position our premium product competitively. Jake Turner, who had been quietly observing from a corner of the room, stepped forward at Maria's signal. I've documented similar practices at other airlines, he explained, but Atlantic's approach is uniquely systematic and explicitly communicated in internal documents. The board chair, Harold Matthews, looked troubled. Maria, what are you recommending? A comprehensive response, Maria replied. Immediate termination of those responsible, a thorough review of all HR processes, implementation of new non-discriminatory service standards, and proactive remediation for affected employees. This could create significant liability, one director noted. The liability already exists, Maria countered. The question is whether we address it honestly or continue enabling discrimination while hoping no one notices. Richard, now sensing the severity of the situation, attempted to distance himself from the policy. I was simply following established practices and Mr. Keller's guidance. I had no idea these approaches could be considered discriminatory. Robert glared at Richard. Don't try to shift responsibility. You were enthusiastic about implementing these standards. As the two men turned against each other, the board watched their defense crumble. I've heard enough, the board chair declared. The evidence is clear and disturbing. I move that we enter executive session to determine appropriate actions. The board's executive session lasted 40 minutes before Richard and Robert were called back into the conference room. The atmosphere had transformed from standard corporate formality to palpable tension. Board members sat with stern expressions, documents arranged neatly before them, as Maria maintained a composed but resolute demeanor at the head of the table. Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Keller, we've reviewed the evidence thoroughly, Harold Matthews, the board chair, began. Before determining final actions, we're giving you an opportunity to respond to these findings in their entirety. Richard spoke first, his earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. I want to clarify that I was implementing what I understood to be established company practices. At no point did I believe my actions constituted discrimination. Yet your own words to Ms. Jackson explicitly referenced her age and appearance as disqualifying factors for first-class service, Josephine Reeves countered, referencing specific documentation. You stated, and I quote, "The gray doesn't project the right energy." How do you reconcile that with non-discriminatory intent? Richard shifted uncomfortably. Those comments were about professional appearance standards, not age discrimination. Every airline has presentation requirements for customer-facing roles. Our employee handbook outlines specific, objective appearance standards, Maria interjected, none of which reference age, race, or subjective energy assessments. You created and enforced unofficial criteria outside company policy. Robert attempted to regain control of the narrative. The board needs to understand the competitive realities of premium air service. Our first-class product competes with international carriers who explicitly select for youth and appearance. We're simply meeting market expectations. Interesting perspective, Maria replied. Let's examine that claim with data. She signaled Diane, who displayed a comparison of customer satisfaction scores across international carriers, segmented by flight attendant demographics. Premium carriers with diverse cabin crews maintaining objective professional standards consistently outperform those prioritizing youth or specific appearances, Maria explained. Your premise is factually incorrect. What's happening in this room is exactly why these discussions occur privately, Robert said, his tone hardening. Marketplace realities don't align with corporate idealism. Every executive in this industry understands the unwritten rules of premium service staffing. To be absolutely clear, Maria stated, you're suggesting that discrimination is an accepted industry practice that should continue despite violating company policies, employment laws, and our ethical standards. I'm suggesting we compete in the real world, not an idealized version of it, Robert replied defensively. These decisions were always about business optimization, not personal bias. Let's address the business impact then, Maria continued, maintaining meticulous control of the discussion. Diane, please share the litigation risk assessment. Diane presented a comprehensive analysis of potential legal and financial exposure from the discriminatory practices, including estimated settlement costs, regulatory penalties, and reputation damage. This business optimization approach has created approximately $43 million in potential liability, Diane concluded. That doesn't include brand damage or employee retention costs. Richard, seeing the mounting evidence against them, attempted to distance himself further from Robert. I was following Mr. Keller's explicit directives. I have emails where he instructed me to refresh the first-class cabin staff and phase out certain crew members regardless of performance metrics. You enthusiastically implemented and expanded those directives, Robert shot back, glaring at Richard. Don't pretend you were a reluctant participant. The confrontation between the two men escalated as each tried to minimize their responsibility. Robert accused Richard of overzealous implementation, while Richard claimed he was fulfilling executive expectations. Gentlemen, the board chair interrupted firmly. This finger-pointing only further demonstrates the deliberate nature of these actions. Neither of you appears to recognize the fundamental problem with systematically discriminating against employees based on age and race. Robert's composure finally cracked. This is corporate theater. Every airline does this. They're just smarter about hiding it. You're sacrificing competitive advantage for political correctness. That statement reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of both our values and business strategy, Maria replied calmly. Atlantic Airlines competes through service excellence, operational reliability, and employee engagement, not by discriminating against our own people. She turned to address the board directly. This isn't just about legal compliance or liability mitigation. This is about who we are as a company and what we stand for. The reputation we've built with employees and customers is based on integrity and respect. These practices violate those core principles. Richard, sensing his position was untenable, made a last attempt at damage control. I recognize my approach was flawed and inappropriate. I'm willing to undergo additional training and implement whatever corrective measures the board deems necessary. The time for corrective training was before you participated in systematic discrimination, Maria replied. What we've uncovered isn't a knowledge gap, it's a deliberate pattern of behavior. Jake Turner, still observing from the corner, stepped forward at Maria's invitation. As an industry journalist, I've investigated similar practices at other airlines. What makes Atlantic's situation unique is the explicit paper trail and the clear involvement of executive leadership. Most carriers maintain plausible deniability through unwritten policies. The board chair nodded gravely. Mr. Turner, your research corroborates that these practices extend beyond Atlantic Airlines. How have other companies addressed similar situations? Most have responded reactively after legal action or public exposure, Jake explained. No major carrier has proactively addressed these issues through internal governance, which presents Atlantic with an opportunity to lead industry reform rather than following the standard damage control playbook. Robert scoffed. This is absurd. We're discussing routine operational decisions as if they're civil rights violations. They are precisely that, Maria stated firmly. Systematic exclusion of qualified employees from positions based on protected characteristics is the definition of discrimination. The fact that you don't recognize that underscores exactly why this board must take decisive action. The confrontation had fully exposed not just the discriminatory practices, but the underlying attitudes that enabled them. Richard appeared defeated, while Robert remained defiant but increasingly isolated as the board's expressions reflected their unanimous disapproval. I believe we have sufficient information to proceed with our decision, the board chair announced. Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Keller, please wait outside while we conclude our deliberations. Atlantic Airlines headquarters hummed with purposeful activity at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the emergency board meeting. Maria surveyed the auditorium, where over 200 managers and supervisors had gathered for what internal communications described as a critical operational update. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation and uncertainty. Rumors had circulated throughout the company following Robert Keller's and Richard Whitmore's abrupt departures. Maria took her position at the podium precisely at 7:30 a.m., flanked by Diane Phillips, the board chair, and several key executives. Good morning, Maria began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Today marks a significant inflection point for Atlantic Airlines, one that realigns our operational practices with our foundational values. She proceeded to outline the situation with methodical precision, explaining the discriminatory practices that had been uncovered and the comprehensive response the company was implementing. There was no corporate euphemism, no minimization of the issues, just clear acknowledgement of the problem and the path forward. Effective immediately, we're implementing a 5-point transformation plan, Maria announced. First, a complete restructuring of our crew assignment protocols with objective, transparent criteria and regular audits to prevent discrimination. Diane stepped forward to explain the new system. which established clear qualification-based standards for all cabin assignments while eliminating subjective assessment categories. Second, Maria continued, we're introducing a protected channel reporting system managed by an independent third party to ensure complaints reach appropriate oversight without interference. The board chair outlined the new governance structure, which included direct board oversight of discrimination reports and mandatory quarterly reviews of employment practices. Third, we're implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all management personnel, with certification requirements and ongoing assessment. Maria paused, surveying the room. Let me be absolutely clear, this training isn't about checking compliance boxes. It's about fundamentally changing how we make decisions and treat our people. Fourth, we're establishing a remediation program for employees affected by previous discriminatory practices, including compensation, restored seniority considerations, and career development support. The scope of the remediation program drew murmurs from the audience. Its thoroughness signaled that the company was assuming full responsibility rather than minimizing liability. Finally, we're creating an industry-leading diversity and inclusion council with representation across all operational levels, tasked with ongoing review of company practices and innovation in creating an equitable workplace. Maria then addressed the immediate personnel changes. Robert Keller and Richard Whitmore are no longer with Atlantic Airlines. Their actions violated our values and policies. We've appointed Sandra Chen as our new VP of In-Flight Services, selected for her exceptional operational record and demonstrated commitment to fairness and inclusion. Sandra, a 20-year company veteran who had risen from flight attendant to senior operations, stepped forward to acknowledge the introduction. This restructuring goes beyond changing personnel, Maria emphasized. We're changing systems, incentives, and accountability structures to ensure these issues cannot recur. The presentation shifted to implementation timelines, with clear metrics and milestone reviews scheduled for each initiative. The comprehensive approach left no doubt about the company's commitment to meaningful change. After explaining the internal changes, Maria addressed the broader implications. Atlantic Airlines will not be the only carrier reckoning with these issues. We've chosen to lead by confronting our problems directly rather than waiting for external pressure to force change. She introduced Jake Turner, who had been invited to observe the session. Mr. Turner's upcoming industry report will highlight discriminatory practices that have become normalized across multiple carriers. Rather than defending the indefensible, we've chosen to transform these challenges into an opportunity to redefine industry standards. Jake briefly outlined his findings, which documented similar patterns at competing airlines without the systematic approach to correction that Atlantic was now implementing. Our response isn't just about addressing past wrongs, Maria continued. It's about creating competitive advantage through authentic commitment to our values. Research consistently shows that diverse, experienced teams deliver superior customer experiences and operational results. Maria revealed that Atlantic would be establishing an industry consortium focused on equitable employment practices, inviting competitors to collaborate on developing shared standards. We're turning what could have been a crisis into a catalyst for positive transformation, she concluded. Not because it's legally required or publicly expected, but because it aligns with who we are and who we aspire to be as a company. After the formal presentation, Maria made herself available for direct questions from managers, demonstrating transparency and personal accountability. When asked about potential business impact, she was forthright. Will this transition be seamless? No, change of this magnitude never is. Will some customers who prefer discriminatory service models choose other carriers? Possibly. But we're committed to proving that excellence and equity are complementary values, not competing ones. 3 months later, Atlantic's quarterly results showed promising trends. Employee retention had improved significantly, operational metrics remained stable, and customer satisfaction scores actually increased slightly across premium cabins. The predicted exodus of premium passengers never materialized. In fact, several corporate clients specifically cited Atlantic's ethical stance in renewing their travel contracts. Maria received an unexpected visitor in her office one afternoon, Tamika, who had been promoted to senior cabin service trainer under the new system. We're seeing real change, Tamika reported. Not just policies on paper, but actual differences in how decisions are made and people are treated. That's encouraging, Maria replied, but transformation is a continuous process, not a destination. We need to remain vigilant. The flight teams wanted you to have this, Tamika said, presenting a small plaque. It read simply, "For the courage to walk in our shoes and the commitment to change the path." As Tamika left, Maria received an email from Jake Turner containing an advance copy of his industry exposé, now titled Breaking the Pattern: How Atlantic Airlines Confronted Discrimination and Redefined Excellence. The article's conclusion captured the essence of the transformation. In an industry where appearance often trumped ability and bias was disguised as premium standards, one company chose to rewrite the rules. Atlantic Airlines' response demonstrates that ethical leadership isn't just morally right, it's strategically sound. By confronting discrimination directly, they've established a blueprint for meaningful change that challenges every competitor to examine their own practices. The question now facing the industry isn't whether discrimination exists, but which companies will have the courage to address it before they're forced to do so. Maria closed the article and gazed at the model Atlantic aircraft on her desk. The company had weathered turbulence before, but this transformation felt different, more fundamental to their identity and future. She had always believed that living their values would ultimately create sustainable success. Now they had the opportunity to prove it, one flight at a time.